Hello, welcome to New Hope Celebrates History, LGBTQ+, Artists and Authors Series. My name is John Milman Dwyer, and I am your host. Now you'll notice that what I did, I now have like an extra name in there, because that actually is, well, more and more part of my identity. There's more and more things about our identities, right? That we're constantly changing, and we're thinking, we're going to be labeling ourselves this and that. And it took a lot to come out, right? To be gay and lesbian. Well, think of what it would be like if you suddenly thought to yourself, well, maybe I'm not the gender that I think that I am. What about if you are told all along that these are female qualities and these are male qualities, and you just realize that that's all bull crap, right? A lot of us do realize that. And some of the most courageous people that I know are people in the transsexual and transgender community who have had the courage and the wisdom to own who they are. That's what we're all doing these days, right? We're owning ourselves. And I have the pleasure and the delight to speak to a new friend, Stefani Moore. And this is her book, Last Dance in Paradise. Kind of like Paradise Lost, only it's like Paradise Found, because there's so many people in it that you'll recognize. If you are a New Hoper, you'll understand who some of these people are, because there's some characteristics you'll go, I know that person, I know who she is. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce you now to Stefani Moore.
Hello and welcome to the next edition of New Hope Celebrates Speaker Series. My name is Stefani Moore. I am the author of Last Dance in Paradise. I want to begin by thanking New Hope Celebrates for inviting me to take part in their prestigious series alongside of some of our local talents like Bobby Egan, Kanoka Wagner, and Damian McNichols. And if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to go back and take a look at their videos. Before we dive into the book, I want to give you a quick background on myself. I'm a lifelong Bucks County resident. I came out in New Hope around 1990. I started out as a newspaper reporter when I was 19 years old, and over the years I've worked for several newspapers. Then I switched gears and went to work in my family's financial business for a number of years. From there I changed careers again and became a local high school English teacher. While I was working as an English teacher, a company offered me a job as a copywriter. Copywriter, think the TV show Mad Men, except without the beehive hairdos and all the cigarettes and all the alcohol at work. But that's basically what I did. I worked as a copywriter for 21 years, creating thousands of pieces of copy, things like magazine articles, magazine ads, advertising campaigns. I created over 75 websites for major corporations, created all kinds of video scripts when I was working. I want to show you a picture here of me at work. Actually, I work in an office of 500 people. We're not there right now because of the pandemic, but I work in a huge office, and one day for Halloween, I went to work as a ghostwriter. Just wanted to share that with you. Ghostwriting is a part of my job. I say all of this not to try to say that I am the reincarnation of Harper Lee or Ernest Hemingway or something like that. I say all this to let you know my background, strictly to let you know that my book, Last Dance in Paradise, was written by someone that's a professional writer that has basically dedicated their life to the art of writing. I decided to write Last Dance in Paradise after seeing what was going on in New Hope in the 1990s. When I first came out, it's sad to say that people were dying left and right from the AIDS crisis. I lost numerous friends. I lost my soulmate. I lost the love of my life. It's tempting to compare the AIDS crisis to what we're currently going through with the COVID pandemic, but there's really no comparison. I don't want to downplay anyone that has suffered due to COVID, but when the AIDS crisis struck, well, there was no vaccine in less than a year. In fact, we're still waiting for a vaccine. the government didn't leap into action. When AIDS first came out in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was president, and I hate to say it, but the government really felt no support. Moral majority people like the Reverend Jerry Falwell at the time was quoted saying that AIDS was God's punishment on the gay man. So it was different. When someone today, if you get COVID, there's like over a 98% recovery rate. With AIDS, there was no recovery rate. I mean, with AIDS, if you got it, it was a death sentence. And I just say that to tell people, if you did not go through that at the time, kind of what it was like. We were really on our own. And to quote Charles Dickens in his opening line in his novel, A Tale of Two Cities, it begins, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." That kind of describes New Hope in the 1980s when I first came here. It was the worst of times in the respect that the best and brightest of a whole generation was being wiped out by the AIDS crisis. But it was the best of times in one regard. And that's that really was the AIDS crisis that kind of brought the gay community together. It really banded them together. We really couldn't rely on anyone else but ourselves. And that's where I almost to some degree feel like we really became a community. The drag shows back in the 90s were the focal point of raising money, of coming together for someone in our community who was sick. And if you think about the hospitality industry, people that work in bars and restaurants, servers and bartenders, so forth, they don't really get benefits. You don't get hospitalization, you don't get disability. So it was really the community. When people were sick and were out of work, it was the community that raised money through drag shows and through organizations like FACT that paid people's bills, paid their medical bills, paid their rent, paid their funeral bills. I really wrote the story for two audiences. One audience is the people that went through this at the time. They'll remember, and in the book they will recognize some of the people that we lost. I also wrote the book for another audience, and that's the people that really weren't here. The younger people today didn't go through this, to kind of maybe give them some pride in our gay community as far as how we banded together during a time of crisis and we took care of each other. On a personal note, the AIDS crisis affected me deeply. I watched the love of my life die of AIDS, a slow and horrible death. Seeing all those things in that time, it made me realize that I'm not immortal. I'm not going to live forever. That we have a limited time here, and if there's something that you really want to do with your life, you really need to start doing it today. I mentioned when I talked about my background that I worked in a family business. I quit that job. I was making over $200,000 a year. I quit that because I really didn't want to spend my life working in my family's business. I wanted to be a writer. So I left that and I became a starving artist. And I've never regretted that. The other thing as far as the AIDS crisis, how it affected me was it made me come out as trans. It is something that I'd always thought about, but I really didn't have the courage until I realized some things from what I was watching in the 1990s. Next, I want to talk about the cover briefly. Last Dance in Paradise is a very short book. It's only 50,000 words. That's considered a novella. A novel is approximately 100,000 words. It only took me 7 months to write the book, but it took me 5 months to come up with the cover. With the cover, I kind of struggled with it. I mentioned I worked in the creative department of a company, so I had access to things like Getty Images. I tried looking at things like women's eye makeup or maybe a high heel shoe. Maybe that would work for the cover, but it really didn't work to me. I felt like the story is a personal story about our community and our people, and I realized what really belonged on the cover was people that represented our community. So I tried, back at that time, Martini Madness was doing the drag shows at the Raven, and I tried going with my camera, and Martini was very gracious, took some pictures of Martini and ginger ale after a show, but unfortunately I'm not a photographer. So the pictures really didn't come out that well. I mean, they weren't professional. From there, I ended up finding a Facebook friend named Paul Doyle that is a professional photographer that had the equipment, the lighting and so forth. And he went with me to what was the Radisson one night. Now it's the Clarion. But there was a show going on that night. It was Married Tonight, Karl Marx, and Mimi Monroe were performing. And after the show, they were gracious enough to let us take their pictures, and several of them, which I'll share. Paul took several pictures. They came out excellent. And on the cover of the book, you see Mimi Monroe is on the left, Karl Marx is in the center, and Mary Knight is on the right. But I really feel very thankful to them to contributing to that part of the book, because I feel like that really gave us, or gave me, the personal cover that I was really looking for. Right now on PBS, there is Ken Burns is running a documentary film series on Ernest Hemingway. I mention this only to say that, to talk just a minute about writing a novel. Ernest Hemingway took his experiences, like he volunteered to be an ambulance driver in World War I. Then he wrote A Farewell to Arms. He was obsessed with bullfighting. He wrote A Sun Also Rises. He was an outdoorsman, he was a fisherman. He wrote An Old Man in the Sea. The point being that as writers, you write about the things that you know. And then you kind of bend them and you twist them and you turn them into a story. And that's kind of what I did with The Last Dance with Paradise. I started with a town I know, New Hope. Now I fictionalized everything, so New Hope is paradise in the story. A lot of the action takes place at a place called the Paradise Inn. That's the Cartwheel. The characters in the book are really based on 25 people. There's 25 characters. They're all based on real people that I met in the early 90s. Some of them living, some of them not. And that's really what I want to spend the rest of my time here, is talking about some of those characters in the book and the real people behind them that inspired those characters. The first chapter in the book is named Mahogany. Now, Mahogany, people, when you read about Mahogany, you might be tempted to look at the cover and see Karl Marx, think, oh, that's Mahogany. No, Karl Marx is not Mahogany. Mahogany is actually based on an entertainer that worked in New Hope, that lived in Philadelphia, but that entertained in New Hope back in the early 90s, named Diane Jones. Diane Jones was kind of unique in our community, back in the respect that she was a transsexual. She lived full-time as a woman. She took hormones. I apologize that I don't have any pictures of Diane Jones, but she looked to me kind of like a cross between the model Iman, very beautiful, and Grace Jones. And she was tall, she was statuesque, she was beautiful. She was kind of a pioneer in the respect that at that time, you think back in the early 90s, I could count the number of transgendered people that were in our community on a couple of fingers. Some of them which end up being characters in the book, including Diane Jones. And you think back in the early 90s, there was no Caitlyn Jenner, there was no RuPaul. People that lived that lifestyle were really kind of rare and very courageous. And just to mention it, at that time, really there weren't really very many occupations for transgendered people. You had entertainer, you had maybe a bartender or a wait or server, you had maybe a drug dealer, or maybe a working girl, a prostitute. That was it. I mean, in those days, you didn't see transgender people coming out of big companies and, you know, having their sex change or their reassignment surgery paid by their insurance. That didn't happen in the 90s. Job options were extremely limited for transgender people. And the story in the first chapter with Mahogany is a working girl. And you get to follow her through the day. Now, I'm not saying that Diane Jones was an entertainer, but the story that Mahogany, what happens with Mahogany in the first chapter, is based on someone that lived in New Hope at the time that had been a working girl up in New York City. And one night sitting in the car, we were chatting, and I said, tell me the story of your favorite trick. And she told me the story of the Eggman. And that's how that story finds its way into chapter 1 with Mahogany. Next chapter is named after Angelique, the character Angelique LaCroix. Now, Angelique LaCroix is really based on a person in our community back in that time named Monique Trudeau. Monique was of Cuban descent. She was from Chicago. She came here in the 1980s. She was a popular entertainer, involved in all the shows, the benefit shows. Monique was a character in her own right. I mean, she was an unusual individual. As what you'll see in the book, the character Angelique, which is based on something Monique did, Monique actually took fangs, vampire fangs, and super glued them to her eye teeth. So it wasn't something she could take off tomorrow. She literally lived as a vampire, a creature of the night, for several months. But that was Monique. Monique also practiced voodoo. And I can remember being at her place in Village 2 and her running around gathering the components for she's going to put some voodoo curse on somebody that she didn't like in the community, creating Cupid dolls, sticking pins in them. That actually was Monique. But like I said, also that when there was a need in the community during the shows, Monique was right there. She was right there performing, entertaining, raising money for people in need. Now Monique, she left New Hope in the late 90s. She met a very nice fellow named Chris, moved off with him to St. Louis, and then a couple of years ago, she retired. The two of them retired to Florida. Monique's been there for the last several years. Sad to say that through Facebook last year, we learned in 2020 that Monique had passed away. There's another character in the chapter on Angelique LaCroix that I want to mention. It's a character, like a recurring character in the book. The character's name is Johnny Martin. Johnny Martin is based on a real person named John Berra. John Berra was someone that worked as a server, as a bartender, almost everywhere in New Hope. The Raven, the Cartwheel, the Prelude. I remember him being at Zadar's, bartending at Zadar's down in town. John Berra, I can still remember the first day that I met him in 1990 at the Cartwheel. I remember him telling me, introducing himself and telling me that he was the nephew of Yogi Berra, the famous Yankee baseball player. John Berra was just one of the most likable people that you'd ever know. And similar to Monique, later in his life, John met the love of his life, a fellow by the name of Bill, and they lived together at Village 2 for many years until John's passing, I want to say about approximately 10 years ago. The character of Mother Cappellini, probably no big surprise, is based on Mother Cavellucci. Mother Cavellucci may be one of the few characters in the book that, if you didn't live here during those times, you may have heard of her. Mother Cavellucci was an icon. She was a treasure in the local community here. She lived above a shop in town. She didn't own a car. She walked everywhere. Everybody knew her. If you saw a mother walking down the road, you picked her up, you drove her where you wanted to. Everybody did this. I mean, straight people, gay people. Mother was kind of amazing in a lot of ways. She was married 5 times. She was a devout Catholic. She was a super Philadelphia sports fan. She watched all the local sports. She had a great sense of humor. She reminded me of my own grandmother, who had an old school, very dry sense of humor, very sarcastic, never cracked a smile while everybody else in the room's cracking up. That was Cavellucci. She was also the town gossip. I mean, if anything was going on in town, Mother knew about it. Really one of the unique things about Mother is that she made us all feel like a family. I remember when I came out in 1990, I was Stephen, I was a boy, and I was her son. I mean, she called me her son. And when I became Stefani, I became her daughter. And if you knew Mother, that's the way she was. She treated a lot of people that way. She called you her son or her daughter. And Mother had a lot of interesting stories. And one of them works its way into the book, a story about, she liked to tell stories about her sons and daughters were born. And I remember her telling me this story about how she went on a cruise to the Bahamas or someplace like that. While she's on the cruise, it was hot and she wanted to get some air. So she goes up onto the deck one night to get some fresh air. And when she's up on the deck, she gets jumped by a dozen Mexican deckhands. They rip her clothes off. They throw her down. They rape her over and over. And then 9 months later, Ricky Crosby was born. That was her story about how Ricky became a member of the family. If you want to know more about Mother, I encourage you to find someone that has the documentary film, I Remember Mother. Mother died May 3rd, 2000. Before she died, a fellow came to town named Tim McMurtry. Tim was a professional video person. And I believe with his job, Tim probably did company videos, things of that nature, but he had a creative side and he wanted to do a film about New Hope, a documentary. And I actually played a small hand about that. I think I was among the first people to meet Tim when he came to New Hope, probably around 1999, 2000. And I introduced him to Mother. And I told him, if you're looking for an idea, I think here's your subject matter for a great story. And Tim saw the wisdom of that, and he created I Remember Mother. something else that people might not realize about that documentary, if you've seen it, I believe it probably came out around 2001 when he was finished with it. And really, he got a little bit of Mother in the film, but really the majority of it is stories about Mother, famous stories about Mother that are told by members of the community. The mayor, Larry Keller, is in it. Shop owners, Tony and Jennifer, people like Pumpkin, all told their stories about Mother, and Tim put them all together. And in 2001, in Philadelphia at the time, there was an international gay and lesbian film festival going on. And Tim entered, I remember, into that film festival and got selected. It was a week-long festival, and every night of the week, there was different themes. And on one particular night, they had like a transgendered theme. And they selected I Remember Mother to be the feature film that night. And I went with Tim and a group of people from New Hope. We went down. It was actually fascinating to see this film about Mother in a movie theater on a big screen. That's an aspect of the documentary some people might not be aware of. Mother actually made it to the big screen. In the chapter on Mother Capellini, there's another character that I want to mention. In the story, his name is Barry Keiser. Barry Keiser is a hairdresser in the story. Barry Keiser is actually based on a real person named Wayne Smeltzer. Wayne was also a hairdresser. He had his own salon down in Ben Salem. But he was also a bar back at the Cartwheel. Back in this period we were talking about in the 90s. Later, in the 2000s, he was a manager at the Raven. He was a manager at the Nevermore. But there's something I want to mention about Wayne. I think about 1996, Wayne came to me one day and he said, "Hey, if you can get Mother to my shop, I'll do her hair for free." I mentioned Mother didn't have a car. And that hair that Mother has, you see in the pictures, that pompadour of hair, that was all her hair. And unfortunately, Mother didn't know how to take care of her hair. So she used to go to salons in New Hope, and you know what salons charge. And Mother really couldn't really afford it. So Wayne said, if you can get her to my shop. So that became part of my daily routine for years. I used to drive to New Hope, pick up Mother on Saturdays. She had a standing appointment at Wayne's shop at noon every Saturday, every week. And Wayne would do her hair for free. And I mention all that because I think it says a lot about Wayne, but I also think it says something about kind of the spirit and the theme of my book, which is community, how people taking care of people. And I think Wayne is a great example of that. The next chapter, a chapter about Pia Rossi, is really based on a person named Danae Ruso. Danae was of Puerto Rican descent. She came from Chicago, where she actually grew up with Monique. Her and Monique both came to New Hope in the 1980s, and they were both the best of friends. Danae was really a professional entertainer. Danae had an incredible resume. When she was in Chicago, she grew up where she grew up. She entertained at the Baton Show Lounge. She moved to Los Angeles, to California. She entertained at the Queen Mary in LA. She entertained at the Parliament House in Orlando in Florida. She entertained in P-Town. She worked at a club called the Latin Quarter in New York City. She had worked at an evening, they had a show called An Evening at La Cage in Atlantic City at Bally's Casino. She performed there as Tina Turner. And Danae actually had spent a portion of her life working in Las Vegas. She was a professional showgirl at the Debbie Reynolds Theater. So when Danae came to New Hope, she really brought a certain professionalism with her that I think that the community and the town really benefited from. Last year, I was, the New Hope Celebrates connected me with, there was a Bucks County magazine, and we'll show a picture of this. It amazes me that Danae's been gone for 26 years, and she's still appearing in local magazines. I think that the New Hope, this Bucks County magazine, I think they found this photograph of Danae, and she had a lot of like publicity photographs, and she would sign them, like giving people autographs type thing. And this one was actually to Robert Ebert, who was the manager at the Raven at the time. Somehow this Bucks County magazine came upon this picture, contacted New Hope Celebrates, who put them in touch with me, and I helped them create this story about Danae. But again, to me, it's amazing. She's been gone 26 years, and they're still writing magazine articles about Danae. I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the AIDS crisis that I lost the love of my life. That was Danae. I met Danae in 1990 when I came out, and really spent the next 6 most wonderful years of my life with her. And there's something else I wanted to mention about Danae, that side of her that not a lot of people really got to see. I'm a single parent. I have a son named Zachary, and I think when Danae moved in with me back in 1990, I think my son was probably 5 or 6 years old, and my son Zach never knew Danae was anything other than a beautiful woman. And Danae really played a unique role in his life. When Zach would go to school in the morning, Danae was the one that made his lunches. When he came home from school, she was the one that sat him down and went through his school bag and helped him with his homework. He wanted to run out with the pack. No, Danae was a stern taskmaster. She sat him down, made him do his homework. If he had to write his spelling words 10 times, she made him write them 30 times. And Zach at the time, he was an A student. And it was really not my doing. It was really Danae's doing. And when Danae passed, I think Zach was probably 10, 11 years old. And it's something I'll never forget. In respect, I remember telling Zach that she had passed, and he started to cry. And he looked at me and he said, "Who's going to take care of us now?" In the chapter on Pia Rossi, there's another character that I want to mention briefly that appears in the story. His name is Big Ike. He's the bouncer at the Paradise Inn. But he's really based on a fellow named Asa, who was the bouncer at the Cartwheel for many years. Asa was a Gulf War veteran. He was someone that was very respected in the community, very likable, very loved. There's a chapter in the book named Jackie Daniels. Well, Jackie is actually someone that I don't want to reveal their real name, because they're actually one of the villains in the story. There's 2 other characters in that chapter by the name of David Merrick and Stephen Henry. Now, they're based on 2 people in our community named Gary Christ and his longtime partner, Scott. A lot of people probably know Gary and Scott. They've probably been around as long as the Logan Inn. They own the Newtown flower and gift shop. I think they've owned it for 40 years. They're long-term members of our community, really icons in our community. And one summer I was at a picnic. Jimmy Arbuckle and his boyfriend John would throw these barbecues in the summertime, which we're not doing now. But one summer when I was at one of Jimmy and John's barbecues, Scott was telling the story about Jackie Daniels. It was a person that they knew. And that's really where the story came from. And I approached them and said, "Would you mind if I use that story in the book?" Now, I can't really tell you anything more about Jackie Daniels. Suffice it to say, you have to read the book to find it out. But that is really a story that came from Gary and Scott, from someone that they knew. I want to mention one other thing about Gary. Back in the early 90s, there was an AIDS benefit called Santa Saturday. It was the biggest event of the year. I mean, it originated at the Cartwheel, and it was the most crowded day of the year at the Cartwheel. You could hardly move through the Cartwheel, and it was an all-day event. It was put on by a group called the Bucks. And the Bucks, they all look like motorcycle guys because they're leather guys, but we used to joke that they probably owned more sewing machines than they did motorcycles, because they would make all kinds of things for the benefit. They would knit Afghans, they would bake pies, they'd make all kinds of things, and they would auction them off during the course of the day. One of the things they would auction off was a boy. They would find a good-looking young boy, and they would auction off every article of his clothing. And his would all the way down to his cock ring that he was wearing, and that could go for $1,000. I mentioned on Saturday to say that Gary Christ was one of the original entertainers. There was the auction, but there was also a drag show that went on all day. And Gary is really one of the original performers. He used to do Liza Minnelli, and he did it for every year at the Cartwheel. Then it moved to the Raven, and sadly it's now in Asbury. New Hope has lost it, but I believe Gary still went to Asbury Park to perform there. So he is really probably the longest running person that has taken part in that benefit. And I think, again, Gary is another person that kind of typifies really the theme of my novel about people helping people. There's a chapter in the book named Lovey L'Amour, named after a character named Lovey L'Amour. Lovey L'Amour is really based on a real person named Christina Chase. Christina was somebody that I met in the 90s. She's really the youngest character in the book. When I met her back then, she was extremely passable. I mean, women in the community used to try to pick her up. They had no idea that she was trans. And there's a bunch of, Lovey tells some, when you meet Lovey in the book, she tells some pretty crazy stories. I'm not going to recount them here. But all of those stories that the character tells are based on real stories that Christina had experienced and gone through many years ago. I want to mention one thing else about the chapter on Lovey L'Amour. As I was writing the book, as I've written all my books, I had a dear friend, a fellow by the name of Jim Morris, that would proofread the chapters for me. And when we got to the chapter on Lovey L'Amour, he fell in love. He was smitten by her. And he said to me, he said, who is this Lovey L'Amour? He knew they were all based on real people. I told him, well, it's based on a friend of mine named Christina. She moved to Wisconsin. She went out to do a show in Wisconsin like 15 years ago, never came back. She is actually back now. She's back taking care of her mother. But at the time, when I was creating the book, she was in Wisconsin. So my friend Jim Morris, who was an older, retired doctor, that very intelligent man, he was a great help to me with my books. And he reached out to Christina through Facebook, and the two of them connected. And I mention this only to say that one of the unexpected consequences of creating this book is that it helped an old man fall in love and find love at an older age. Now, Jim passed away recently, a couple of years ago. It's also a character in the book. You meet a character in the book named Jack Stanway, who was a wealthy man, same as Jim Morris, and he was really a benefactor, primarily the trans community. He really was extremely helpful to a number of people in the community, including Christina. Timmy Melons is another character in the book. Timmy is based on another real person. Timmy is the character in the book that everyone is coming together. You meet all these people during the course of the book, all these different characters, and during the course of the story, they all come together at the end of the book at the Paradise Inn, Cartwheel, to put on a show. And what they're doing is they're all coming together to put on a show for Timmy Melons, who is someone that is dying of AIDS. Timmy is dying of something called Kaposi sarcoma, which was a form of cancer that some people caught, and it was horrible. It was actually one of the most frightening things about AIDS, because people would get these lesions, raised lesions. They had this wasting sickness. They wasted down to nothing, and they had these lesions, painful lesions all over the body that really did look like the plague. That's Timmy in our story. In talking about Timmy, I want to mention another real person by the name of Ryan White. In the book, I start each of the chapters with a quote from a different news source. And on Timmy's chapter, I quote something by a fellow by the name of Ryan White. Ryan White was a young man that caught AIDS in the 90s. He was a young person. I believe he lived in Illinois. He was a hemophiliac, and he got AIDS through a blood transfusion. And it's sad to say, where I think most of America really didn't care too much about the AIDS crisis, Ryan White was a very sympathetic character then. He was not gay. He was someone that caught AIDS, and he suffered from it. And I think he brought a lot of attention, actually, to AIDS. And I want to read something that Ryan wrote back in those times, because part of Timmy's story, similar to Ryan's story, here's something that he wrote back then. Because of the lack of education on AIDS, discrimination, fear, panic, and lies surrounded me. I was not welcome anywhere. People would get up and leave so they would not have to sit near me. Even at church, people would not shake my hand. I read that because to give you an idea of what people that had AIDS, people like Timmy, kind of went through. It wasn't the same as COVID in the respect that people like COVID, I think, are kind of quarantined, but there was a certain fear that accompanied AIDS because it was a death sentence. There was no recovery from it. So there was a lot of fear that surrounded it. Timmy in the book is based on a real person named David Torlino. When I came out in 1990, David was a bartender at the Cartwheel. David was a very handsome man. He was beloved in our community. He was an artist. And actually, in the story, when you meet Timmy, he's painting these backdrops from one of the other characters, Pia Rossi, which is a little bit of art imitating life in the respect that David actually painted the backdrops for Danae Ruso. When she won the Miss Gay Pennsylvania pageant in 1990, it was David Torlino that painted her backdrops. There's a chapter in the book called The Judges. And during the benefit for Timmy, a part of that is you have these entertainers coming together and they're competing for a pageant, the Miss New Jersey pageant. So you have these judges that you meet in the course of the story, all of them based on people in our community. The head judge in the story is a fellow by the name of Bruce Slavin. It's based on Ed Kimble, also known as Barry Lyndon. I don't know that anyone can come to New Hope without knowing Ed and Eric. They own Mystical Times. They are fixtures in our community. Probably been here as long as the Cannon in the center of town. I mean, Ed and Eric, besides Barry Lyndon entertaining, and I think when I came out in 1990, Barry actually won the Miss Cartwheel pageant. But Ed and Eric, what I want to say about them or mention about them is that they were very influential back in those days when the AIDS crisis was going on as far as organizing the AIDS benefits. They organized many an AIDS benefits. People, Ed and Eric, Kitty Keiser and Jackie, there was a group of people kind of behind the scenes that were organizing these things and raising money for people that were in need. The next judge in that chapter is a fellow by the name of Carl Killian, based on Kevin Gilmore, also known as Phoebe Mantrappe. And I should probably say that Barry Lyndon, Phoebe Mantrappe, and I think our Pumpkin are probably among, I don't quote me on this, but I believe they're probably among the few entertainers that were entertaining back in those days that are still entertaining today. Phoebe, I don't know if a lot of people know this, Phoebe was actually majored in theater at Temple. So Phoebe has an entertainment background. I want to share some pictures of Phoebe. Back around the year 2000, she was in a fashion show in Lambertville. And after the fashion show, someone came up to me and Phoebe at the time were best of friends. And someone came up, a professional photographer came up to us and said she had created this thing called the Drag Queen's Cookbook. It's filled with recipes and pictures of drag queens. And she asked us to pose for her in her studio because she was going to come out with another Drag Queen's Cookbook. Whether she did or not, I have no clue. But I wanted to share some of those pictures of Phoebe and myself. The next judge in the story is a character by the name of Devin DiMuzio. Devin is based on a real person named Tony DiNardo, Little Tony. Tony worked as a painter for many years, actually a painter of houses, actually helped me paint my house at one point. She lived in an apartment right next to the Wrightsville Inn. Tony and Linda, her girlfriend Linda, were a fixture in the community in the early 90s. Sadly, Tony just passed away in the last few years. Tony was, little Tony was a bundle of energy. I think she was tougher than half of the men that I knew. She was a no-nonsense type of person that I really admired and respected. And to me, Tony is kind of representative of the women in our community, because even though the AIDS crisis might have been striking down men and transgender people, the women were right there with us. I mean, when people got sick, they were right there helping them. They were taking part in everything. I think they suffered just as much as everyone else did. Last of the judges, there's a character named Harry Lou Hawkins, based on a real person named Jerry Ann Miller, real name Jerry Winarski. Jerry was a bar back at the Cartwheel in this time period in the early 90s. He's a hairdresser, still working as a hairdresser. Jerry doesn't come out so much in New Hope anymore. He's really gravitated towards the Woods Campground in the Poconos. People are familiar with the Woods. I called Jerry the mayor of the Woods. He's just, but Jerry has an incredible sense of humor. Always admired his sense of humor, and hopefully that comes across in the book. There's one other character on the chapter you meet the judges. There's another character that you meet. In the book, his name's Arthur Marks. He's another person that I don't want to mention his real name. He's not per se a villain, but he's based on the first promoter of the Miss Gay Pennsylvania pageant when it came to Pennsylvania. He was kind of a little bit of a shady character, which comes across in the book. He has passed away. I don't want to disparage someone that has passed away, but I really kind of mentioned him to say that after he left, Ricky Crosby took over the Miss Pennsylvania pageant, which was held here in New Hope. Ricky Paris, unfortunately, we lost in the last few years, and also Joey Ray. Another person we've lost, but they really made the pageant honorable, honest. They brought an honesty to it that was kind of lacking when it first came here. Then you've also had people like Jennifer Wall, Sharon Fronabarger have been involved with it, and the pageant has really benefited from those people in our community, from their involvement in it. Just a couple more characters that I want to mention here. In one of the chapters, there's a character that you meet named Kook. Kook is really based on Geritol. Sadly, say another person in our community that we've lost in recent years here. Josie, one of the bartenders, one of his nicknames for Geritol was Kook. So that's kind of where I picked that up. Geritol was probably among the most creative people that I've ever met in our town. She also entertained as Erica Kane. She was just a wild, creative person that was really a very close friend, and I miss her dearly. During the show, during the book, during the benefit show, there's an MC of the show. The character's name is Mona Lott, which really doesn't do justice to the real person that she's based on, which is Tinsel Garland, which I think is probably one of the best drag names that I've ever heard. Tinsel was a comedian that did the shows in the 90s. In the book, you see the character wearing a Glenda the Good Witch costume from The Wizard of Oz. Well, it was Tinsel. Tinsel had a costume like that. In fact, Tinsel was one of the things that made her great was her costumes, which were made by her partner. And Tinsel was really a professional comedian. She was kind of the Joan Rivers of New Hope. And she did the Monday night shows, the drag shows at the Cartwheel. And they were more crowded. The Cartwheel was more crowded on a Monday night a lot of times than it was on Saturday because people would come out in droves to see Tinsel. And what is she going to do next? Tinsel moved away from New Hope. The last I'd heard, she lived in Pittsburgh. She still comes here on occasion and does shows. And I mention this to say that if you get an opportunity to see Tinsel performing, you should see it. You won't be disappointed. Last person I want to mention, the last chapter in the book, is named Peaches. Peaches is the name of a dog, actually based on a real dog by the name of Midge. There's a character in the book named Bobby Roberts that when you come in the door at the Paradise Inn, which really is based on Mary Margaret. Mary Margaret worked the door at the Cartwheel for many years, and when you came in and saw Mary Margaret, she always had her dog Midge there in a little carrying case kind of with her. And Mary Margaret, I think, is another person that was Miss Cartwheel at one point in the 90s. Mary Margaret, longtime figure in our community, respected person for her work with animals. And her dog, the dog Peaches, actually becomes one of the heroes in the story. That's really all the characters that I wanted to talk about. Last thing I kind of want to say is I've had, since the book has come out, I've had people come up to me and said, well, how come I'm not in the book? Or how come, Ricky Crosby's not in the book, or Monica Ray? And my stock response is that they are in the book. They're a part of the community. They're in the crowd scenes. That's always been my stock response. But if I feel bad about anything in the book, it's that I can't mention everyone. We have a wealth of community-minded, spirited people in this town. Could go on and on mentioning their names, but if all of them were in the book, it wouldn't be a short little novella. It would be War and Peace. That really kind of wraps up everything I wanted to say about the book. I wanted to close by saying that you can find it on Amazon.com, but I'm not here to sell books. I'm really here. My hope is that people will take an interest in the book because it's really that I wanted to share our story. I wanted to pass along our story. And one of the things I want to mention is I didn't write the book to make money. That was not my goal. My goal was to share our story. And New Hope Celebrates has been so generous and kind to me. I mean, it's sort of supporting the book. So I wanted to say any of the royalties that I get from the book for this year, for 2021, I'm going to donate them to New Hope Celebrates, just as my way of saying thank you to them for being very supportive of me.